The time is now 6:35, and I'd like to call this December 4th School Board Work Session to order. The School Board would like to take this moment to respectfully acknowledge that we're residing on the traditional land of the Nene people. Our mission, our mission is to provide an excellent and equitable education in a safe, supportive environment so that all students may succeed and contribute to a diverse and ever-changing society. Ms. Richardson, would you please call the roll?
Mr. Burgess,
Still here.
Mrs. Burnett,
Here.
Mr. Dorn,
Here.
Miss Maple,
Here.
Miss Marati,
Here.
Mrs. Sanderson,
Here.
Mrs. Hardy.
Here.
Thank you. The board has a quorum.
The first item on our agenda is a report and discussion with the Executive Director of the Coalition of Equity or Education Equity of Alaska, Caroline Storm. She is joining us via Zoom to discuss education equity and the work of her organization. Dr. Meinert, Mr. DeGraw, and myself had the opportunity to meet with Ms. Storm at the legislative office with some of the interior delegation, and I found that meeting very informative, and we felt that the rest of the board might benefit from hearing this information as well as the listening public. So that is the intent of this report.
Is that me now? Sorry.
That is you now, and I'm still learning the ropes. So.
All right. For full disclosure, I also met with Mr. Duran when I was in Fairbanks to have a one-on-one meeting to discuss his experience in rural Alaska and to just introduce myself. Mr. Duran and my in-laws are well acquainted. And also, thank you for providing this opportunity for me. I am attending via Zoom from New Mexico right now. I am down for a couple of weeks while my partner is doing some work down here. The Coalition for Education Equity was formed more than 20 years ago by Superintendent Spike Jorgensen at the time. And the coalition was formed to address the inequity in funding capital projects between boroughs and municipalities that had the opportunity to bond to fund capital projects and rural districts that had no opportunity to bond to fund capital projects. So through the case Kasaili, formerly SEAC and now the Coalition for Education Equity, rectified that inequity. Since that time, the coalition has continued to advocate for equitable and adequate public education funding. As we are all aware, public education has been flat funded for well over a decade. And even though there have been one-time bumps in education funding, there is an extreme amount of uncertainty from year to year, and districts are unable to adequately plan from year to year based on forward funding or what they perceive to be what their funding will be the next year. So this year, the Coalition for Education Equity is taking all of that advocacy work and again preparing for a lawsuit against the state, because we know that over a decade of advocacy has not resulted in a significant, meaningful, consistent funding mechanism for public education that the state of Alaska is constitutionally mandated to provide. So our hope is that we won't have to file a lawsuit. However, we will ensure that any bill that is passed in the legislature is inflation proofed and has adequate accountability that the money will go towards teacher retention and teacher training. So those are our current goals. And thank you for your time right now. If you have additional questions, I will happily answer them.
Are there questions from the board? Ms. Sanderson?
Thank you for your time and with us this afternoon. Can you tell me who else is partnering in this suit with you?
NEA, ACSA have committed to providing amicus briefs should it be required. We are entertaining, well, entertaining is the wrong word. We are soliciting support from national groups like NAACP and ACLU. Right now, I'm not speaking for the coalition's board, but public education is an equity issue. It's a civil rights issue. And so those are the people we're talking to right now to partner with us in this education lawsuit.
Thank you.
Mr. Doran?
Hi, Carolyn. Good to see you again. Thanks for joining us tonight and sharing some information.
Of course.
I did, as you started out, that you're preparing for a lawsuit and hope not to have to do that. Could you maybe talk a little bit more about what the Coalition for Educational Equity is doing and bring information together that might be helpful to legislators and to others throughout our community, all the different segments, businesses, educators, parent groups, et cetera, in terms of the importance, the case for investing in public education? That makes sense.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. So for this group, I think we all understand the case for public education is pretty obvious. We want an educated populace. We want a strong workforce. We want to keep families here. Alaska is obviously seeing population attrition, which is surprising. This is no longer the best place to raise a family, and we want to turn that around. So we are talking to chambers of commerce, and Bill and AFL-CIO, who's supporting us in this also from the workforce development standpoint. From an equity issue or equity standpoint, we know that not every child learns the same way. And so we want to ensure that there's adequate funding to ensure that there are enough teachers in the classroom, enough professionals in the classroom, enough support in the classroom to address every child's need for individualized intervention. And I'm not talking about every child needs to learn on their own. I'm just saying, you know, every child needs a few minutes of one-on-one instruction in a class day or in a classroom. We are gathering data on the amount of funding that is being, I will use the word literally like sucked out of the classroom to support facilities and insurance premiums. We know personally how our insurance rates are going up. We know how our health insurance premiums are going up, but I don't think the general public understands the level of impact that has on a school district and how much the premiums for insurance, for utilities are sucking money out of the classroom. I'll take UPIT district, for example. Right now, they're paying double what they did for fuel 2 years ago to heat their classrooms. That's an enormous cost to our rural districts. And I'm sure you're well aware of that in Fairbanks. So the data we're requesting and actually publishing for a broader audience are the numbers that are being pulled out of the classroom that are not necessarily obvious in an initial budget.
Mr. Doran?
And follow up on that. Thank you. So part of the financial data that you're looking for is what draws away from the classroom. Given that, well, we always, as a general number, 80% is personnel for school district budgets. Could you talk a little bit what you're seeing and what data you're looking at that actually impacts educator staff recruitment, retention, and how that plays into the equity picture that you're looking at? And part of this is just as your awareness is for the public as well as ourselves learning these things.
So we all know that housing costs have increased dramatically in the last 3 to 5 years in Alaska, and that's across the board. So when we talk about numbers being sucked out of a classroom, we're also talking about the amount of money that it takes to support a teacher, just at a base level. If we're going to support a teacher or a paraprofessional, what are we going to pay them to be able to afford groceries and a place to live, in addition to their benefits, which are going up astronomically? I mean, that's the hockey puck graphic for health insurance, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the number that is difficult to derive because school districts don't directly pay health insurance, but we're trying to figure out that number, which is an indirect cost to supporting qualified teachers and retaining qualified teachers.
Could I ask a clarification?
Go ahead, Mr. Doran.
You had mentioned that districts don't pay health insurance, but we are. We all, and that is one of our increased costs. So I'm a little confused.
Okay, so I apologize. Some districts directly pay health insurance. Anchorage pays through a health trust. So some districts that I've requested that number from have said we don't have a direct line to that cost because it's through a health trust. So I apologize if I miscommunicated that, and I will do much better to gather that data directly from districts if they are directly paying that number. And I'm sure you have that number at hand. And it's not only health insurance, it's all the insurances you pay that have gone up year over year, you know, almost doubled.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Are there other questions from the board? Mr. Doran?
Surprise. I've got to go. So right now, SIA is very focused, and I know that was the original piece of its, I was around at that time when Spike Jorgensen and many others came together. Uh, it was more along financial equity. Is that still the primary focus of the coalition?
That is I love the word squishy. It's kind of it's a squishy question and it's a squishy answer, because when you talk about equity, there's a lot of different aspects to that, obviously. But the issues facing every district are a little bit different. And then when you say the issues facing Lower Kuskokwim versus Anchorage, they're very different. So when we talk about equity, we want to ensure that every child in Alaska has the opportunity to have a meaningful education that prepares them for whatever they want to do after they graduate high school. That means very different things in different districts. So I would say that equity is still the main focus of the coalition. And at the root of that right now is the base student allocation. Because every district is struggling. There's not one single district that is not struggling to meet, their financial obligation. And so when a district is struggling to meet their financial obligation, they are definitely not meeting the needs of every child in the state.
Can I continue?
Go ahead, Mr. Doran.
So for our purposes of going forward, and if there's data that might be requested, et cetera, we're focusing, the coalition at this time is coalescing around financial or funding equity. As you say, there's lots of pieces of equity, but for this premise, it's the financial aspects of it. What do they provide the resource? We have the money to provide the resources that we need.
Yes, exactly. And this is where I don't want to answer necessarily what every district needs, because those needs are different where the money goes. But just considering that education has been flat funded for a decade, notwithstanding a few one-time bumps, which does not provide consistent, reliable funding, there are still a lot of holes. So yes, we are focused on equity through the lens of rectifying adequate funding at this point in time. I probably should add that we are watching the tribal compact process and support that, and just want to make sure that through that process, resources aren't directed away from the regular public education system. And I'll say it again, I want to be clear that we absolutely support tribal compacting and tribal schools, as long as it maintains the equity of every student, regardless of race and gender in the state.
Great, thank you. That's very helpful information. And I have another question.
Is there anyone else? All right, Mr. Doran.
Okay. Not too long ago, the state report on educator retention and recruitment came out, and a lot of the recommendations actually focused on districts and cost factors within districts. And I was wondering whether SIA is looking at that report, and in terms of adequate resources, adequate funding from the state level to address some of those recommendations, if you have any connections at this point, linking the two things together.
We definitely have looked at the report, and just for clarification, you're talking about the one that was very recently in the
Right.
December issue published, right?
Well, there was the article, you might be referring to an article that was supposed to have been in
The
the,
Economics Forum.
right, that
Yeah.
was not published in the economic magazine. But there was a separate Alaska teacher retention and recruitment report with recommendations that came out from the governor's office within the
Yes.
last month or two.
Yeah. We have definitely looked at that, and that's a lovely report, and yet almost, well, I'm not going to hazard a percentage right now. A lot of the suggestions in there need adequate funding or additional funding. So the report partially published by Barbara Adams, is that the one you're referring to?
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, it's great. There's a lot of really great suggestions in there, and we need adequate funding to support it. So the bottom line right now is there are a lot of issues that we need to address and the education system needs to address specifically, but without additional funding, we literally cannot get there. So that's what we're focused on this session.
Mr. Doran.
Okay, this will be my last one. Sorry, put you on this spot here. Just in terms of, as you mentioned, when SEA was first came to the fore, it was partially the adequacy of funding to address some concerns between road system, non-road system, rural areas, that type of funding situation. In terms of today and different from what the concerns were 20 years ago, could you just give us a brief overview of the difference of approach today than it was maybe 20 years ago and the needs that have changed?
Yes. So as Mr. Jorgensen recently told me, don't say sorry. So Mr. Doran, don't say sorry. Can be, it doesn't have to be your last question. So more than 20 years ago, the inequity issue was how capital funds were expended in boroughs and municipalities that could bond versus areas that could not bond and could not support adequate capital investment. There is still tremendous inequity in our education system in Alaska because of the lack of acknowledgement of how different districts need to address public education for a myriad of reasons. So the inequity has shifted from capital funding to how to address trauma, how to address poverty, how to address food insecurity, how to legitimately, we have acknowledged that different cultures decode language differently. So how are educators trained to help children in different districts in our state decode language and understand problems? So the Coalition for Education Equity has shifted from a very big capital improvement in equity problem to smaller I'll say cultural problems that are harder to define. But I believe actually really underscore the inequity in our state.
Thank you.
Mrs. Burnett.
Hi, thank you for your time tonight and for being here. I like to sit and listen and just kind of take everything in. I've also been sitting here on the website doing a lot of reading on a Coalition for Education Equity. And I guess my biggest questions for you would be, how would the Coalition for Education Equity promote the equity between small and big districts? Mr. Doran had brought up, the rural, the big, and when we go to AASB for legislative priorities and for just figuring out how we're going to tackle the legislature through all the districts, how do you separate and how do you also bring into view the fact that a big district such as Fairbanks or Anchorage, they say we've got a champagne taste on a Budweiser budget, right? That's the best way I can describe it. We have a lot, but we don't have enough, and we are facing a lot of shortfalls and downfalls with our district, just like smaller districts are. But sometimes going into it, when you look at these smaller districts and you realize, the housing shortages and the food shortages and the price of things and the cost of living there. How would you promote the equity between the big, who maybe not have those extreme of problems, but our problems are still the same, if that makes sense?
Thank you, Ms. Burnett, and it was lovely to meet you at AASB. I don't think you can expect that a child's experience in Newtok is going to be similar to Fairbanks. They're different environments. So the opportunities in Newtok are not ever going to be the same as in Fairbanks. It also doesn't mean that the opportunities should be decreased in Fairbanks or Juneau or Anchorage or Kenai because we can't provide the same opportunities in Newtok. Or, choose your rural school. However, my personal frustration when I go to Juneau or talk to legislators is that they want an easy answer and they want to consolidate school districts and come up with this sort of silver bullet solution. And I will continue to, and the coalition will continue to advocate for solutions that meet the needs of the children where they are.
Thank you.
So what does that, I'll just end with, what does that look like for Fairbanks? I don't have the answer. You have the answer. What does that look like for UPIT School District? Superintendent Ballard has that answer. I don't have the answer. However, there has to be some measure for the fact that kids are getting what they need to succeed after they graduate.
I'm going to put myself in the queue. I had two questions. Is the CE gathering data on some of the unfunded mandates and the inequity there around like Alaska Reads or the testing that's required, and how that's affecting districts' funding?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, as well as I do right now that data is brand new, but almost none of the districts can meet the deed standard for the tutoring 1 to 5 suggestion. So the funding is not there to meet that mandate. As good as that Reads Act is, you know, whether you agree with it or not, it has moved the needle, and we need to actually fund it. So that will be a huge part of the data we are gathering to support a lawsuit. Absolutely.
And then I guess my second question is, you had mentioned that the goal is to eventually, hopefully, avoid a lawsuit. So what legislative priorities is your organization putting forward? I know you've spoken to a tremendous amount of legislators at this point, and we're about to work on our board's individual legislative priorities. So hearing some of that feedback to help us think about ours.
At a minimum, we would need to see the BSA adjusted to the 680 passed with some inflation proofing. We already know the 680 is not adequate. But even if the legislature was willing to acknowledge that the BSA needed to be raised by that amount and then commit to some sort of inflation proofing, at least there would be some like consistent increase every year. And then we can work on additional bills. What I've heard from legislators is that there is a big concern that even if the legislature passes that bill, that the governor will veto it. So I don't want to be in a position, me personally, coalition doesn't want to be in a position of playing chicken with the governor. Sadly.
Mr. Doran?
Is transportation one of the conversations as well besides the BSA?
We are not focused on transportation. However, if you would like to propose something, not necessarily right now, but if you'd like to propose something to the coalition to include in a potential lawsuit or in my conversations with legislators, I'm happy to hear from you.
Okay, thank you, because that certainly has been an area that has not seen increases even longer than the BSA and does have impacts on some districts, not all. And then I had one question for the chair and the superintendent.
Go ahead, Mr. Doran.
Okay. I was wondering, as part of the beginning of this presentation, which I really appreciate having, that you had heard it with our interior delegation, other points that we may not have covered that stood out for you during that time that would be helpful for us as a board to know and to be aware of, that those are things that our interior delegation, or at least some members, had heard. So we would be informed if we were asked about it.
Do you want to go first?
Sure, I'll take that one. A lot of our conversation did surround around the Reads Act, so I'm glad that was brought up. As you've heard me speak on funding for the Reads Act or lack thereof, there's a lot of conversation around that. There's requirements in the bill that puts additional burdens and costs on districts that are pretty substantial, especially for a district our size. One of them being the outside of school day intervention supports we are required to provide students, both during the school year and during the summer months. That can run on the low end for a district our size, about $1.5 million, up to substantially higher if you were providing really robust intervention services. Additionally, we discussed with the interior legislation DEED's reaction to our plan to implement the Reads Act. One of their critiques was our intervention size. They came back and said, hey, you know, your intervention sizes are a lot bigger than what we would suggest. And it's like, they are. You know, what could solve that for us is adequate education funding. And so we discussed that with Ms. Storm and the interior delegation about how they could potentially help us out with that. And, you know, the model for the Reads Act was after other states that had similar legislation, but the big difference in Alaska is that we didn't decide to fund it like other states had.
I think the one other thing that was brought up by some of the legislators was House Bill 106, which is Governor Dunleavy's teacher incentive pay program, and that as a possible avenue to avoid a veto, incorporating that into our legislative asks. Were there any other questions from the board for Ms. Storm? Ms. Marati?
Not a question, but well, maybe a question. So on my birthday, on December 15th, the governor is going to hopefully provide his budget. I guess, Ms. Storm, is there anything we should expect?
I did meet with Senator Wielkowski just a couple days ago. I'm sorry for laughing that your birthday coincides with the budget release. I do apologize. It's not funny. That he will potentially reduce education funding even further. That's what I've heard. That I have no basis for. Yeah, it's all hearsay, unfortunately.
Are there any other questions? Seeing none, thank you so much for spending your time while I'm assuming is on vacation to share this information with the board. We so appreciate that.
It's my absolute pleasure. It's a working relocation. So my time is your time, and please reach out to me via email or text anytime. I'm happy to answer any other questions. Thank you.
Thank you. So the next item on our work session discussion is talking about our legislative priorities for 2024. And the idea was there will be a legislative committee meeting that is happening, and now I'm blanking on the date. Help me. It's on the 11th. That's what I thought, and I should have stuck with it. On the 11th of January. Oh, no, of December. Sorry, it's late, guys. And since currently that is not a full board committee, this allows us to discuss and be able to bring the board's discussion to that committee, and then it will come back after the legislative committee's meeting to the full board for a vote, but allows us to all have input. Is there anyone who wants to start the discussion off? We did include last year's legislative priorities attached. I have a printed out sheet. We didn't figure they will have changed dramatically, but that was a pretty good place to start. Ms. Burnett.
First off, I just want to say thank you, President Hardy, for making the committee of the whole thing happen. That's awesome and amazing, and I absolutely support that. And honestly, our legislative priorities from last year are pretty spot on to things we still need. I know that we're looking at possibly a little bit more than the 6,800 with what we agreed upon at AASB. But outside of that, I don't think that we should really move away from the BSA deferred maintenance or the funding calendar. I definitely think that's something we should continuously try to push, because I think if we can fix the funding calendar, we could maybe solve a lot of other issues as well. And then, of course, staff recruitment and retention, that's a big one as well. So I kind of like where we are with last year's priorities, maybe with just a couple increases and things.
Thank you. Is there anyone else? Ms. Marati.
I'm curious to hear the board's opinion on the deferred maintenance, and I am wholeheartedly supportive of funding deferred maintenance in a more efficient and greater way. But for legislative priorities, what does the board think about keeping it or removing it?
There's no vote. It's discussing. Usually we'd be around the table, but because we were doing Zoom and don't have a lot of other attendees, so just raise your hand. I'll call on you. Yep.
I'm looking at the sheet. The thing that strikes me, and it comes back to what Ms. Marati just said, is that the staff recruitment and retention piece is visibly small. And while I know that that doesn't have anything to do with the way that we feel about it, our eyes aren't the only eyes on this sheet. And when I was looking, trying to make sense of like, okay, well, how could those things look like they are more like prioritized on par with one another? The deferred maintenance was actually what I went to first in wondering if having that take a step back to focus more on this staff recruitment and retention piece. Obviously, it's important to like have a very specific small grouping of things. But that piece is something, I mean, I know those are conversations that we're having with the assembly as well. I don't know, I think I'd like to see the staff recruitment and retention piece be more robust than it is. And I know that means remove, like taking away something to keep the like one page simple, straightforward, here's where we are. I know that has, it's important to have it be that digestible, so.
Wasn't sure if that was a hand, Miss Marati. Yes, Miss Marati.
I'd love to hear more opinions on the deferred maintenance. I appreciate Ms. Maple's opinion. I'm also wondering what the board's opinion is on adding in Alaska Reads Act support. I'm not sure where. And then I'd also like to know the board's opinion on support for HB 106 under number 2. So only specifically for what we just talked about hoping that that would persuade the governor to not veto funding.
Mrs. Burnett.
I agree with HB 102. But yeah, 106, sorry. HB 106 being put into the number 2 there. I think that's key and could possibly help. Who knows? As for the deferred maintenance, my only concern is things going by the wayside. I know that they kind of already are. So that's kind of redundant to say, but I know we have things still going on like over at Hutch and such. And I would really hate to see these fall even further down and not be taken care of. Now, as Ms. Maple said, we are in discussions with the assembly and things like that as well. If we were to push the deferred maintenance off of here, there was something else Ms. Marati brought up. The Reads Act, yes, I would 100%, sorry. I was trying to keep everything in my head all at once. I would absolutely support throwing the Reads Act into here for additional funding for that. I think most of us are under the understanding that we don't have anywhere near enough of what we are being required to put out. So I would definitely support that. But again, I'm really, really weary on removing the deferred maintenance. We just have a lot of things we need to fix, and I'd like to see them get fixed.
Mr. Dorn, was your hand up or?
For at some point during it. And I will have several questions, but.
Clearer with the signals. This, not doing it. Okay, so Mr. Burgess.
Yeah, thanks. So as far as deferred maintenance, I think that there's a few pieces to this, and I'm not sure that we're really showing all of it on this. When I was on the budget committee last year as a parent member, I understood I believe from the presentation from facilities and maintenance that that part of the reason we have so much deferred maintenance is because of staffing issues and not being able to do routine maintenance, so it gets pushed back. So I would say that if we take deferred maintenance off of here, we might want to work on reframing that or including it in staffing issues rather than removing it entirely. And that said, you know, I do think that the big projects that are funded through capital improvement projects are also important. I don't know if it's necessarily the most important thing to put on here at this time. I do think, in response to Ms. Marati's question about Alaska Reads Act, we should certainly highlight that that is an unfunded mandate for our district, and that it's a reason to increase the BSA even further than you know, what we would otherwise need. So I would support putting those in as well as supporting HB 106.
Mrs. Burnett?
I got a big light bulb from Mr. Burgess there, and my thinking with what going off of what he just said with deferred maintenance, it's due to staffing, right? Could we maybe highlight it? We don't necessarily have to do like a deferred maintenance portion, but we could highlight it in the number 2 portion under staff recruitment and retention. We could maybe add in there staffing for deferred maintenance, something along those lines. I mean, because if that's the reasoning why we have so much, it could work like that.
Dr. Minert?
I love the suggestion, Ms. Burnett. I would actually suggest that we put it under number 1 with our BSA ask, because really, as we've seen the BSA or the revenues from the state not keep up with our need, our FMD staffing has gone down. I think over the last 3 years, we've lost 23 plus FMD staff members. And so I think it would be good to highlight, but probably alongside the funding portion of things.
Mrs. Sanderson?
Thank you, President Hardy. So, 40 years in this district, we've seen our buildings go down in maintenance, and the biggest issue is Ms. Carrion has come to us and explained, you know, these work orders that get put in, there is absolutely zero staff to make that happen. My big concern, I feel that no matter how we tackled this priority, we really thought way outside of the box last year. I felt the board did an excellent job of looking at everything, and I feel we'll do the same this year. We went so far as to not only have our written legislative priorities, but we put together a 10-minute simple video that really highlighted what we do well, what we provide for our students, where we are, the size of our district, and spending 3 days walking up and down, and myself talking to 22 legislators, not one of them looked at that video, not one of them. And it was well done. I referred to it while I was out this past week at the Vision Conference, just to share with people the work that this district does. So, you know, I think we are so up against a mindset of a governor, and even the legislators don't seem that they want to challenge the mindset of this governor. And it is leaving us, our students, not being funded, our districts not being able to, you know, not secure teachers and staff and programs. So I'll commend the work that we're going to do, but there has to be a way to have a legit conversation with our governor and say, you know, unless you are actually trying to sabotage education for the entire state of Alaska, you know, we have come to you year after year. In fact, I'm an associate adjunct professor in New Mexico. And he put it to me like this. He said, every year I brush off my hat and I go up to our legislators, and he said, I beg again for the support of our students and the staff. And he said, I'm sick of doing that. He said, what else is it that we need to do? And I feel that we are being penalized in the way the governor is perceiving how we are distributing and distributing our education goals. And I don't know that we are going to be able to come up with I think we're going to present something. We're going to do our absolute best to advocate for it, to have these open conversations, to touch their mind, their heart, to get them to see our vision. But you know, it's really in my head that this governor's mindset, that's what we're up against. And as we reconfig, I do think that our staff and recruitment is where we are going to have to, because we have programs that we cannot sustain. And that is just a fact, because we do not have, we need to beef up our IELTS and, you know, just what we offer to that population there. And so I think that not only in our priorities, but I really have the vision of us having conversations to have partnerships, mentorships, apprenticeships, I don't know, with university people. We don't have a science teacher, I know a chemistry teacher. And so, you know, we have people at the university, we have students in those classes, we have professors in those classes, and I think it's time that we stretch ourselves and partner and make these coalitions that we can be sustained, because no matter what move this legislation does, we're still tasked with what we have to do for our students. So I'll just commend the board for what we're going to do and how we're going to tackle this thing. But I do see the staff and recruitment is our challenge.
Thank you, Ms. Anderson. And I'm going to put myself in the queue real quick. I did see you, Ms. Marati. Kind of dovetailing into that, I think you're absolutely right that we did a lot last year and we didn't see the needle move. And my perspective is that these legislative priorities that we're going to make, that we're going to vote on, they cannot just be this board's legislative priorities. They have to be our community's legislative priorities. Shout out to this committee that will be meeting has a parent slot that's open. So we do need a parent to apply and be a part of our legislative committee, because we are committed to having these be the community's legislative priorities too, and making sure that our legislators know that, because just as much as this board is public servants to our community, our local interior delegation are public servants. All of the representatives of Alaska are supposed to be working for the population of Alaska. And one governor who maybe doesn't seem to see public education the same way that the rest of us do should not be the stumbling block into making sure that our students and are adequately funded to have an equal and equitable educational opportunity. And one thing I would like us to do a little different this year is finding ways to empower our community's voices. We show up and we are just elected board members, and for better or for worse, I've internalized the fact that I am now a politician. I don't really love that, but that's what I am. And so my voice doesn't carry the same power as a mom or a dad who is working 2 jobs, who is also taking the time to email or call and say, I care about my kid's school, I care about my kid's teacher, and I only need to know that part. And I know that if we don't get funding, that's who suffers. Every single student in Fairbanks feels the impact of flat funding. And empowering our community to feel comfortable using their voices and being knowledgeable, because I think one of the biggest stumbling blocks is feeling like you don't know enough, and so you don't say anything at all, because nobody wants to feel like they're uninformed. I see you, Ms. Burnett, but I did tell Ms. Marati.
Thanks, I'll be quick. in regards to what Mrs. Sanderson was saying, I think that sounds a lot like strategic planning, and I am all for our board getting started on our strategic plan because it does expire um, in a little over a year, and so we'll note that I think for when that happens, and I'm excited about that. In regards to the video last year and it didn't work and I think the one thing I took away from our meeting with the interior delegation last week or this week, I can't remember now, was that face-to-face time with the legislators is imperative. And I think that is one reason last year the video didn't quite work, because we weren't there saying, watch this, please pay attention. But when we're face to face, we can say those things, and I'm not sure if we can play a video for them, but I saw the benefit of it, but the follow through and the accountability, there wasn't a way to do that with them being in Juneau and us being here. So I hope that we can continue a face to face method to see if we can make that work. And then until 2 years ago, the legislative priorities was actually 4 pages, but it wasn't 4 individual pages. And help me, communications department, Ms. Herbie, to explain how this was. But it was one long page folded in half, so like a folder. So it wasn't any like more loose paper, but it was 4 pages, and it explained more than just our priorities. It explained why our district deserves an investment and what we were doing and how we were meeting our goals. And it was very robust. It was very beautiful to look at, well made. It was a lot though, it was 4 pages. So I wonder if there's more information that's needed than just this 1 page ask. I'm not sure. That would be a big board decision. And then lastly, I love what President Hardy was talking about the parent voice and being stronger. And something that we've been talking a lot about is providing more education from the district and board to the parents, probably through the parent engagement committee, but maybe working with the PTAs so that we can have education opportunities to give them the talking points and to give them the legislative priorities and to give them the contact information and show them how to work with us and partner with us as parents and raise their voices. But yeah, through the chair.
Ms. Herbie?
So I just want to comment on what we've done in the past. So there's been debate in the legislative committee over the years of what is the most effective. So previous years we have had a handout that would be left with legislators. It's been multiple pages. At some point it's been double-sided, a handout. And it's the debate has been what is most effective. So we've had a handout we've left before. Do the legislators see it? Do they even read it? I've heard multiple things of maybe they do, maybe they don't, maybe their aides read it and the aides are who are knowledgeable and then inform the legislators about it. The idea with the legislative priorities that you see are their talking points that you see from last year is that these are for you. They're not what are left with the legislators. These are talking points for you to use when you have that face-to-face time, with the idea that from last year, what came about from talking from the legislative committee from last year was essentially that what was valuable was that face-to-face time, and that was what was most effective. And so what was most helpful for the committee last year was for us to give you resources, those talking points, what's information that you guys need when you're going to talk to those legislators and other stakeholders, what's the information that you need readily, and you can have it on hand. And so it was really, it's a public document, but it was really more of an internal document for what is helpful for you to have, what is going to be most effective for you. And so it's really a decision for you as a board to make of what you feel will be most effective. If you feel it's a handout that you can be left with legislators, then we can do that for you. If you feel it's a document that is, we're going to really prioritize that face-to-face time, and we need talking points and those pieces of information that we can rattle off and have that on hand, then we'll prepare that for you. So it's really what you feel will be most effective, and it's just kind of changed from year to year depending on what the board has felt. And so that's just sort of the history of it a little bit. But it can be what you need it to be.
Thank you. Mrs. Burnett?
Thank you, President Hardy. So first off, Miss Herbie, thank you for that video last year. You guys really rocked it. I know it didn't work, but thank you. Just tenfold thank you. And I think that Miss Herbie is right. We are trying to do a lot, right? And I think that we all have great ideas. I do like the piece of paper to be able to have to go off of and things like that when we have those face to faces. But I also wanted to throw this out there. I know many of us have spent a lot of last few weeks, a lot of last few months, pretty much practically the whole last year talking to legislators, talking to borough assembly members, talking to anybody we can get our hands on to just kind of help further our cause. And what I have found is that the majority of the legislatures are kind of right there with us. They understand, they know that we need something. Maybe it's not everything we're asking for, but they know we need something. And I keep hearing, the 680 number. I keep hearing that they're trying, they've got these bills and things. Maybe our job is to appeal to the governor this year. Everything that I have come across, discussions I have had, including with him, it's a stone wall. And we have to figure out how to get past that stone wall. And I know that that's a hard game, right? That's kind of like a devil's advocate situation. But how can we, as a school board, appeal to through the legislature to the governor? How can we show them that we are achieving student success? How can we prove to him that we do have the accountability and the things that he is asking for, we have done? We have, and we have check marked it almost synonymously. Every time he's asked for something, we've check marked it, we've done it. So how can we, through the legislature, appeal better to that aspect to show that we are promoting and achieving student success? I kind of liked Miss Marati's idea of, and Miss Hardy's idea, not just of the parent on the legislative committee, but appealing to our PTAs and bringing them into this as well. I think that hearing not just from the school board, but from our PTAs, the ones that are right there at the schools consistently, and also from our community members and our parents. But I guess back to how can we appeal through the legislature to the governor, I think maybe needs to be more along the lines of our thinking this year. Maybe I'm wrong. That's just kind of where I'm at with it.
Mr. Doran.
Thank you. I've got several things. One, I want to say thank you for this opportunity for having a broad conversation as a board before the legislative committee. And I was very glad to hear that this is no intent to replace that because I think that's extremely important because that brings the partners to the table with the idea that too we can have a common voice. We know what they're looking at and feel we need to advocate for as well as what we do. And of course, it comes back to us. We make the final decision for our piece of this in January. I had written down that I like the one page. I would actually go for 2 pages, but one page that has our highlights, and the second, however, there are others who are better at publications of those things. But 3 topics that really jumped for me is, and I think keeping it to 3 is good, but it's funding, it's staffing, and it's learning. Learning was not on our last year's, but I think it needs to be there, and we're hearing that with the READS Act. But there are also other legislative things that are coming out that are being put out there that do impact the learning of our students. I'm going to say the Attorney General's letter is one of those. There's other legislation that the governor has put forward and that I understand that other legislators are working on to put into the mix that will have direct impacts on instruction and learning for our students. And so I think that's an aspect that we need to have there. Some of the avenues that people have said, well, what do you think about this or that? As I go down our thing. One, I think we can remove funding calendar. It's a great impact upon us, but that's going to take change in law. Also, the borough has to change its law. That's one of the first deadlines we have that we have to have. So, you know, eventually we might get there, but I think the biggest thing is we need money, and let's keep that on there. Part of the funding calendar we cannot, we don't impact when the legislature does its business, when it adjourns, when the governor takes his action, and the legislature having an opportunity to come back and, if necessary, reverse vetoes. And so I would say I think that's a red herring and a distractor rather than something that really focuses on the funding. The BSA is absolutely important. I mean, there's no question in terms of the capital budget, but the bottom line is we need the funding, period, to operate and to be able to do even basic maintenance. That's what we're finding, that we're running into problems, even preventive maintenance, let alone the big things. And so I would keep our focus on what we need to operate as schools and to provide the environment that's appropriate for learning for our students. In terms of staffing and recruitment, I would be really cautious. Actually, I'd be highly against including HB 106 in there. It's, again, a red herring. The governor put it forward. It's non-sustainable. It doesn't provide a good attraction for teachers and other educators, and it can't just be for teachers. We need educational staff broadly, and it's one-time money. Sure, if we get a couple extra bucks in our pocket, it's always helpful, but it's a distractor to what we need is sustainable and appropriate compensation for staff. The other thing, it's really divisive because it divides rural and urban teachers. It divides between certified and non-certified staff. And we've watched that in practice here before, back in the early 2000s under the SBA assessments, standards-based assessments that the state gave, and then they were giving bonuses to only a small number of schools at different levels, whether you were a teacher or support staff, and it was really divisive. And then it went away. Bonuses don't solve the funding issue. It only postpones it. And it's a nice little something to hang out there. So I would be really cautious about letting that be there. If a compromise needs to be worked out between the legislature and the governor, then they'll work that out. They did that around the READS Act. And there was a quid pro quo, not in a bad way, just in terms of, okay, this legislation and that legislation that went hand in hand. That's what they'll need to work on, but I would not in any way advocate for HB 106 with any legislator as that being a quid pro quo. So I'm going to pause there, but I do want back in the queue.
Ms. Maple. And then
Two things. The first, going back to the conversation about like what we actually put forward, not the contents of it, but the format of it. And I'm sure we'll get into this more at the legislative committee meeting. But last year when I went down with Chamber, we had a rack card, a pretty significant, like a tall one, but narrow, with our priorities that we handed to every legislator as we entered the room, and then also had, our script, the closer to what this piece from last year that we're looking at.
And we had extra copies of that for those legislators that were interested in more detail to leave. But we got a ton of positive feedback about those really simple, large, clearly like large text, large paper rack cards. And I can bring those from last year to that legislative committee hearings for other people to get a look at as we decide what we'd want to do. But I know that that was really, really well received. And then the other thing I wanted to comment on, I agree. So I find myself really torn between wanting to appeal to the governor and wanting to say, well, this is what we need and this is what I want to advocate for. And I think that it needs to be two-pronged, that we have a two-prong approach. So I agree that figuring out what that appeal is, even though sometimes it kind of goes against what I think is, the right thing to do, but finding a way to both really advocate for those things that we find most important and also do our best to appeal to the person that has the power here. That I think that's going to be a really big challenge and something that we're certainly capable of. And that I look forward to digging into further at that committee meeting. But I do think it's important to really evaluate both sides of that and figure out how we move forward and make requests that are true to what we need and hopefully will get a yes, which seems that it's proven quite impossible to do, but we're going to keep trying. So that's all.
Mrs. Sanderson.
Oh, I just sent to the school board, everybody, the news letter from one of our senators so that we can read it. And I suggest that we get on all of their mailing lists so that we know what they're thinking and what they're saying. So when we approach, we'll know that information. And I do agree with Ms. Moradi when she says that we need to empower our community and whoever else said it. Because we're all thinking, we're all honing in on that one thing. And you know what struck me too about last year, and I don't know if anybody else will agree, but how the student voice was so profound last year. It was the first year, I think, in a long time that I've heard from so many students from across the state of Alaska, and they actually were on duty. They were in the hallways, they were in meetings, and they didn't mince any words when they said things like, I'm only going to school because of the music program. My life has not been a great life. This helps me function. It helps me feel connected. We had kids who said things like, or students who said things like, you're interrupting my education because you refuse to fund. And so it's not like they're not hearing. And I just think we'll take the best of our strategies and approach this as we always do. So, yeah. Thanks.
Carm, you're welcome to do that. Mr. Doran.
This is so true.
Are we ready?
You're ready, Mr. Doran.
I'll be here.
Okay. As I was thinking about this and over the years and our recent meeting with the Interior Delegation, I know was some of the members had other schedules that they needed to leave early from the Interior Delegation, not board members. I think in between the governor and the legislature is the ones who have the power. They have the final say. And I know that one of the things that was coming out, well, why did the governor do the veto of the one-time supplemental to the tune of 50% cut when he had said he was going to leave it up to the legislature in his state of the state and in his budget conversations presentation. And the legislature decided not to follow up on it. And some said, we voted the first time, or sorry, I will say, what I have heard is that some have said, essentially, we voted for the money, but we knew he was going to do it. I don't know whether that's accurate or not. But the thing is, the legislature has this last voice. They can still act in January. But what this really brought home to me is, how do we get more legislators to have a full understanding of what our needs are, and for them to be able to advocate and take action aside from the governor? The governor only has a veto power, and he can only use it once. If it's overridden, that's it. And the legislature can do that. It's a heavy lift. And so part of my personal reflection is, in a sense, how do I make sure that I am heard? Whether as an individual, as a member of the board, representing our community. And what struck me is, I know last year at a town hall held locally with a number of our interior delegation there, and I appreciated their taking the time to be there. But my testimony was not the best. The points that I included, I think the content was fine. But I walked out saying I was strident. And where perhaps somebody might have listened to me more was my delivery. And part of it was my frustration. And I think as we go forward in figuring out what is the information that is most helpful to them. We had a delegate the other day who really asked, about information, and I was really left with, what information does that person really need that we can provide, and how do we do it? And again, I think I'm reflecting more on myself. How do I convey that information, whether it was to a state legislator, whether it was to a borough assembly member, that I can be passionate, but I need to make sure that I avoid becoming strident, because we cannot afford to turn anyone away. I cannot afford to turn anyone off. And it's too easy to get up on my pedestal. So I'm just sharing that reflection, because I think that is one of the things that we have legislators who will listen, and I've had great conversations over the years with them, and that's why I have a lot of faith, who may or may not agree on the final vote. They represent a lot of people, a lot of factors, but where at least we can have a conversation that's two ways. And so I'm hoping we can do that as we go forward. So again, I'll pause, and you can put me in the key.
Ms. Marati?
Thanks. Mrs. Sanderson was talking about the student voice last year and how profound it is, and I cannot agree more. And what I've seen other districts do is that they bring students to Juneau. There's even, during the legislative fly-in, there's a student conference and program that's put on by AASB, and we've always wanted to send students there. I'm willing to pay my own way and give up my cost for a student to go instead. Whatever we have to do to get that student voice to Juneau in front of legislators and ensure that they listen to the students. I will do whatever I can in my power or ability to do. Another thing, Mr. Doran was saying, how do I ensure I'm heard? And we're talking a lot about legislators in Juneau. But I think we did a great job with our interior delegation in helping them carry the word back to share with their colleagues. And I'd like to follow through with that. And if you weren't there, what we did is we asked them to sign up to go into schools so that they can see firsthand what our educators and the sites of our schools are about and what they're doing and what they need. And Mrs. Poland sent out a spreadsheet today that had all of the representatives, the dates, the times, the schools, and when they were going to go, and gave us the ability to sign up to go with them. And I'd love all of us, if you have the time to go. I'm working 3 jobs, but I found a way to go to 2 of them. So I'm hoping that if you can, and I know that we all cannot, and it's a privilege if you can, but please, if you can, take a look at that and sign up if you can.
Ms. Burnett.
So I am absolutely loving all of this conversation and not trying to take away from it. But I am curious, are we trying to decide on legislative priorities for this sheet tonight? And if we are, should we maybe move back in that direction? Again, I love this conversation and I think it's absolutely amazing. And all of us are adding in some really great things. I'm not trying to take away from that. I just would really like to, with the strength of time, I mean, it's 8 o'clock already. So if we could get back to that, it'd be awesome.
Nope, I appreciate that. So the legislative committee has 3 members, myself, Ms. Maple, are 3 board members. There's many other members, but Ms. Maple and Ms. Marati, but that is not reflective of the entire board. And so the goal of this meeting was to get other board members' input, in a way that was open meetings compliant, so that we can bring those perspectives in drafting that legislative priority. So like I've been taking notes and kind of referencing what people have and haven't said, and I found it beneficial. And I was actually going to put myself in the queue before I go back to Mr. Doran, because I do know he's there. And Erin, you already did your piece, right? Or did you have another thing? Okay, I got lost in my list. But I will add Mr. Burgess. The one thing that I feel like I maybe set us up to not have a clear discussion on when I mentioned HB 106 previously was, like I said, that was a legislator that brought that up. So I do think hearing the discussion that we've had tonight is important, because I do anticipate that they will bring it up again with any one of us, and possibly having a board discussion on that bill and what we think about it. Some things that I mentioned to those legislators when we had that discussion was, this is how the sausage gets made, and that bill might have been how the governor gave it to us. That doesn't mean that's how the governor, if it were to pass, what it would look like when he signs it. So saying what would make that a bill that isn't so objectionable. One of my big points was that the funding ends about the same time the governor's terms end. I don't think that that is, forward funding our education or our educators. Making sure that special education and funding both paraprofessionals and certified special educators in there as part of those incentive programs. Like if we were going to give them advice on how to make this a better bill, having that discussion as a board, because they might ask us, I want all of us to have things to give them of, if this is what we're having to do to get something past the governor's veto, these are the things that would make it a better bill, because that is unfortunately the nature of politics. And I should have said all of that a while ago, but now that I have said it, we will go to Mr. Burgess since he hasn't said much, and then to Mr. Doran.
I really appreciate that clarification. I was actually going to discuss HB 106 because I think after hearing Mr. Doran, I was persuaded that it does not necessarily need to be part of the document that we're working on or a priority for us. But I do appreciate that perspective that giving additional feedback on what might make it better, it should be a priority. whether or not it passes, we don't want it to pass if it's not what we need. And there is some concern there too on that, providing funding specifically for bonuses is not necessarily funding education in general. Staff recruitment and retention is certainly important, but if school districts had the money that we needed, we wouldn't need a bill from the state supplementing teacher salaries with bonuses. So I wanted to, I wanted to clarify and put my support behind Mr. Doran's statements there. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Mr. Doran?
A couple of things, and again, as this conversation keeps going, which is, yes, second, third, fourth, whatever, that this conversation is good, and I think it's a very appropriate and important one for us to have. I did like the idea of making the offer for legislators to visit schools. Just as a thought, it would have been nice to check the availability of the board members beforehand, somewhat, because I know I'm pretty booked on the next couple of days. So, and as others are, and but I think also watching that if a legislator is not able to come on those specific dates, and I didn't see the sign up form, that we extend an offer to, and with flexibility for other legislators to come to our schools. If they just meet with the principal and go through, that's great.
So point of clarification. I am, yeah. We did not pick those dates. We gave the legislators basically a blank check and said, you tell us your availability and we will plug you into a school, and then we will hopefully have a board member to go with you. But we figured that that was the lowest barrier to entry to getting them into our schools.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification. And I think that when we look at what the legislature, how they work things through with the governor, that as I've watched this over many governors and legislatures, one of the things you try to avoid is telling them how to do it. Tell them what you want and then let them work it out, because these things don't necessarily even go education within education. They can be across the board on something else, across departments, and let them do that. And I'm, since you asked again about the HB 106 and getting some information on that, yeah, it's one-time funding, and who's expected to pick it up afterwards is the districts, which only makes us go further into the hole. There is no question that we need to pay educators more. And I use that term very broadly. If we don't have someone to keep the boilers running, the school's going to close. It's going to be shut down. So we need money to appropriately pay for things like that, as well as for a teacher in the classroom. And so I think the advocacy towards what are those big things that we need, those broad categories, and then giving them an opportunity to the legislature to work out how they address it. I think it is important because I believe there is a real lack of visual information. Maybe those are some graphs that were mentioned earlier that we broaden our handout a little bit. We may have to dangle it in front of their faces, or as I know, some board members took the video and they said, oh, I pulled it up on my phone and played it because they had not looked at it. I think that video was great with the students speaking and others. It was short, it was to the point. and it was a way of amplifying the student voice. So I would give serious consideration of doing that. I don't know all the background work that went into getting it done, so that has to be factored in. But having something that's there, and I think what a lot of legislators don't understand, and sometimes assembly members, is people look, community members, and they say, oh, our enrollments are down. Our state population is down. Our community population is down. And so those are the things that we need to factor in. Our costs are up. So simply saying our numbers are down, so our expenditures should be down. Our costs are up, and I think that we can, I think there are graphics out there. I think the publication, the article that was briefly referenced when we were talking to Ms. Storm on the Alaska economic study that was done and had anticipated being published this month, that it did come out unofficially and has been reported on by several of the news media, that we really look at that, because that has very good data that needs to be part of our talking points, and does show how costs have gone up, not just in our state, but supported by some of the national norms or national data that they've incorporated into that report relative to Alaska. I think it is important that we have some continuity or consistency of information across our districts so that we can be supportive of each other. And why a dollar amount is important, that we may not get what we know we need. That doesn't mean we don't advocate and we don't provide the information. Why that dollar amount? Where did that come up from? It wasn't just pulled out of the air. There are calculations to that. When we say, let's get at least the one-time funding that the legislature authorized for and was willing to appropriate for education, again this coming year, that there was a reason that number came forward. It was a compromise number, but there was good rationale for it, and I think advocating in terms of that. I think in terms of saying, what did the one-time $87.5 million, $8 million for us as a district, what did that mean for us? Okay. What did it mean for the services to our kids? But then, as we've also talked about, saying, what did we lose? We would have gotten $16 million under the legislative appropriation. What did we lose? And I think those are things that we can put forward. And I guess I would say that it's worth correcting me, because I keep saying we have cut upwards of $50 million in the last several years. I have not been told it's wrong, but I have been told, well, maybe it's not quite accurate. Well, what's the accurate number? When I do the rough add up of what we've cut in the last several years, it exceeds $50 million. So I think those are some information. What are our major talking points, our priorities? First page, but then I think some graphic. And again, they're not going to go through. I've done it. I've taken information to Washington. I've taken it to Juneau. I've taken it across the town here. And yes, it's accepted and often put aside. Maybe a little glance at it. But if we have that, if we can put it in our hands of the PTA, we have had our community groups, our parent groups, who have really taken our message forward, have filled the assembly chamber, have gone to Juneau. They go down there at the state PTA. What are we hooking into them? As well as, the other educational groups, the business groups that go down. So just looking at ways that we can do that and just tossing out some suggestions. And I look forward to the legislative committee itself, because I've been on it. They bring great ideas to the fore. It's a good brainstorming. It's a good bringing together of different approaches. And what's important is very often they have the ear of this legislator or that legislator or this assembly member or that assembly member whose ear I might not have. And I think that's what's important. And I really say, to the great credit of the board over the last year, every single member reached out to legislators, and especially to ones that they might have had a particular connection to, as well as to the others, because it's good they have to hear, all of them have to hear from all of us. But I think that working together was important, and that as a state, we really made an impact, that the legislature put forward the largest one-time supplemental, or I'm sorry, not supplemental, one-time funding for education in, I believe, the history of the state, but I will say definitely in the last 40 years, that I can say from personal experience. That was the largest jump. They couldn't get it into the BSA, but with a extreme majority of the vote, that they passed it, and didn't all play out as everyone had hoped, but it was done. A step was taken forward. We just need to take the next step. So I think we need to really recognize, and I'll wrap up with this, to really thank the legislators, because they did vote for that money for education. We need them to take the next step and follow through on their vote. But we have to really say thank you, because I know for many of them, it was not their first preference. It was indeed a compromise. And part of it was the give and the take that said, okay, we're going to have a budget. This is part of it. And education was the beneficiary. And we did get 87.5 million, 8 million for our district. So I think that we make sure that we start from that premise and say, okay, how do we build on it? How do we make sure we get a larger amount and an amount that comes with sustainability? And on a lighter, perhaps with a little bit less intensity, but as significant importance, is how do we carry that conversation to the borough? Okay? And I'll just say, I'm not looking to go to the cap, but I'm looking to increase what the borough invests. So.
Did you have something, Ms. Marati?
Real quick, to piggyback on that last thing that Mr. Doran said about the borough, are we still planning to meet with the borough?
We were hoping
As a
for
board?
a date. Dr. Minor and I had met with the mayor and presiding officer Fletcher, was it last week? Feels like forever now. We did ask quite a few times to have a set date, and I'm not sure, Dr. Minor, if you got one yet.
We did not get a set date at this time.
It is my intention, and I will keep requesting that we have a joint meeting with the Borough Assembly and ourselves. And we'll let you know as soon as we get those dates. They're very busy over there too. In the interest of time, it now being past 8 p.m., are there any other closing or comments anyone needs to make? Ms. Marati?
Just wanted to thank you again for bringing this to the whole board. And I look forward to it being a whole board thing going forward as soon as we can get our policy changed.
Mr. Burgess?
I'll also express my gratitude there for the same reason. And I want to say that, you know, I plan that like the, I think it's been mentioned, but I think it's a really good idea that we reach out in every direction that we can. That means legislator, governor, borough assembly, and the community in general, empowering them to advocate for their students as well. So I intend to get working on that to the extent possible. Thanks.
Mr. Doran?
I'll add my thanks for having this general conversation and reaffirm the fact that the board acts as a whole board. It's not a committee on this, and we act on it. We will actually take action on it in January. I hope that this type of conversation does not replace our committee, our legislative committee, because I think that forms a different premise, different input from stakeholders that we would be at a loss if that went away.
I can say it's not my intent to replace the legislative committee. We will discuss during the board retreat, which we now have a date, whether or not we want to expand the membership so that it is all board members able to participate in the committee and not just those. But we can discuss that at the board retreat, not now. Seeing no other comments, we are adjourned.
Move to adjourn.
I thought it's a work session, but okay.
Second.